Legally speaking, criminal responsibility in Germany begins at the age of 14. It is assumed that younger children are simply incapable committing crimes because it is believed that, due to their age, they are not able to inflict serious harm on others. Moreover, from a psychological perspective, it is believed they are not capable of wishing death upon anyone. However, today's story completely refutes this view. We will recount the events that recently took place in 2023. This horrifying incident has completely overturned the German law enforcement authorities' perspective on the shortcomings of their own criminal justice system. This case became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Europe in 2023. The striking aspect was less the brutality of the murder and more the age of the participant. Moreover, their age was so young that leading psychiatrists could not predict what these children might become. In any case, some of the characters in this video will remain unnamed and without pictures, as the law of the country protects them in this regard. Louise was a resident of Freudenberg, Germany. In 2023, she had just turned 12 years old. The girl attended the local school and showed good performance. She was quiet and shy, even a bit too shy. The student was so gentle that other children eventually began to see it as a weakness. The girl avoided conflict, and therefore some children started to mock her at school. At first, she simply ignored the teasing, but gradually it turned into bullying. Despite her young age, Louise felt the unjustified anger of others. Several other girls began bullying her, and it seemed they would not stop. The protagonist of the story wanted to handle the problem herself. Louise did not tell her parents or her teachers at school about the incident. But two girls, around 12 or 13 years old, regularly picked her up after school and accompanied her home, mocking and taunting her. They intentionally chose a time when they would not be seen by adults. The cruel jokes continued during classes and breaks whenever they found time to ridicule the girl in front of her classmates. All of this happened at times when the teachers were unaware of what was going on. In fact, Louise and these girls had been friends for a long time. After the failure of their relationship, Louise hoped that things would return to normal and that the girls could communicate as they had before. However, the situation only got worse. Over several months, the bullying became a daily occurrence, and it seemed that the two girls came to school only to harass their ex-friend. The protagonist of the story was afraid to fight back. Despite the bullying, she tried to extend a verbal hand to her tormentors, but it did not work. As is always the case in such situations, the impunity only worsened the behavior. The perpetrators became bolder, sometimes even flying into a rage. Legally speaking, criminal responsibility in Germany begins at the age of 14. It is assumed that younger children are simply incapable committing crimes because it is believed that, due to their age, they are not able to inflict serious harm on others. Moreover, from a psychological perspective, it is believed they are not capable of wishing death upon anyone. However, today's story completely refutes this view. We will recount the events that recently took place in 2023. This horrifying incident has completely overturned the German law enforcement authorities' perspective on the shortcomings of their own criminal justice system. This case became one of the most sensational criminal cases in Europe in 2023. The striking aspect was less the brutality of the murder and more the age of the participant. Moreover, their age was so young that leading psychiatrists could not predict what these children might become. In any case, some of the characters in this video will remain unnamed and without pictures, as the law of the country protects them in this regard. Louise was a resident of Freudenberg, Germany. In 2023, she had just turned 12 years old. The girl attended the local school and showed good performance. She was quiet and shy, even a bit too shy. The student was so gentle that other children eventually began to see it as a weakness. The girl avoided conflict, and therefore some children started to mock her at school. At first, she simply ignored the teasing, but gradually it turned into bullying. Despite her young age, Louise felt the unjustified anger of others. Several other girls began bullying her, and it seemed they would not stop. The protagonist of the story wanted to handle the problem herself. Louise did not tell her parents or her teachers at school about the incident. But two girls, around 12 or 13 years old, regularly picked her up after school and accompanied her home, mocking and taunting her. They intentionally chose a time when they would not be seen by adults. The cruel jokes continued during classes and breaks whenever they found time to ridicule the girl in front of her classmates. All of this happened at times when the teachers were unaware of what was going on. In fact, Louise and these girls had been friends for a long time. After the failure of their relationship, Louise hoped that things would return to normal and that the girls could communicate as they had before. However, the situation only got worse. Over several months, the bullying became a daily occurrence, and it seemed that the two girls came to school only to harass their ex-friend. The protagonist of the story was afraid to fight back. Despite the bullying, she tried to extend a verbal hand to her tormentors, but it did not work. As is always the case in such situations, the impunity only worsened the behavior. The perpetrators became bolder, sometimes even flying into a rage. On Saturday, March 11th, they planned to spend the evening together as agreed. That day, Louise's mother and father noticed how much their daughter had changed. In recent months, she had been depressed, often locking herself in her room and not communicating well. She no longer wanted to go to school. Now, it seemed everything was turning for the better. The student had a smile on her face and was in a good mood. Naturally, her mother was also happy and readily let her go to her friends. The woman had heard about their quarrels and was glad the girls had restored their friendship. She had seen how shy her daughter was and knew how difficult it was for her to make friends, though she was just as happy as Louise herself. The friends lived not far from each other, and there was a path between their houses that led through a small forest, but it was also possible to take a detour via the city streets. This route seemed safer, and it was always the path Louise chose. After lunch, the protagonist of the story went for the agreed visit. When she arrived at her friend's house, she called her mother to report that she had arrived. The student planned to spend a few hours there and then return home. Her parents set a deadline for her to be home by 6 p.m. and asked her not to be late. Louise was, however, a responsible girl and always followed her parents' rules. This time, however, she did not come home on time. Her mother became worried and called her daughter, but she did not answer. More than 15 minutes passed, but the girl did not return. Numerous calls went unanswered, and even messages sent through messengers were not read by Louise. The mother became increasingly worried. Then she called the friend at whose house the meeting took place. The girl reported that the protagonist of the story had left a long time ago, as had the other friend. It had been over half an hour, which meant Louise should have been home long ago. After several more unsuccessful attempts to reach her daughter by phone, the mother and father began to search for her. They got into the family car and drove along the route where their daughter was supposed to be, checking several shops, but the student was nowhere to be found. People they questioned had not seen anyone who looked like Louise. All the while, the daughter's mobile phone remained silent. Finally, the mother and father decided to go to the police. They filed a report about the child's disappearance, providing the police officers with all the information they needed to start searching for her. The police took the report seriously, as it concerned a 12-year-old child. The town where they lived was quite small, with about 17,000 inhabitants, and the community was very close-knit. Many people here knew each other, so the incident had alarmed the citizens. Most had families and children who were now in danger. The law enforcement authorities turned to the media to involve volunteers in the search and rescue operation. But even without this, a large number of people volunteered to help Louise's family. Additionally, it was necessary to send out a warning in case there were witnesses with valuable information. The search for the girl began that same evening, but the darkness of the night limited the possibilities and made the search difficult. Both units with dogs and aviation were involved in the operation. Early in the morning, volunteers and searchers were heavily engaged in the case. Meanwhile, the police officers spoke with the two friends with whom Louise had met the evening she disappeared. The students appeared worried and frightened, which was not surprising as they were 12 and 13-year-old girls. They were likely concerned about their friend and themselves. Their parents were also worried because any of them could have been in Louise's place. There was a fear that a child abductor might be lurking in the neighborhood. Initially, the volunteers searched the neighboring area between the friends' houses. Police officers began to check the immediate neighborhood of the teenager in the hope of finding out if she might have been acquainted with anyone dangerous. The only suspicious information the investigators could gather were the statements of the school teacher who taught all three children. According to the teacher's statement, Louise had complained about these friends only 2 days before her disappearance. However, this seemed insignificant, and nothing suspicious could be found beyond that. On Sunday afternoon, a group of volunteers went through the forest area between the girls' houses. There was also a shorter path that Louise could have taken to get home. She had never taken this path before, but it was worth exploring, and for good reason. About 3 kilometers from Louise's house, near the old train station, a girl's body was found. The victim had been hit on the head with a blunt object. A plastic bag was found on her head, and the girl's clothes were soaked in blood. Forensic examination allowed for the identification of the body, which turned out to be the missing Louise. Apparently, the student had died an unnatural death. The medical examiner found more than 30 stab wounds on her body. These were shallow stab wounds located on almost all parts of the dead girl's body. Several large blood vessels had been severed. According to the medical examiner's findings, the cause of death was excessive blood loss. After receiving the inflicted injuries, she quickly lost consciousness and died within minutes before reaching her home. There were no signs of dragging on the body, and there was no indication of sexual assault. It seemed to be a senseless murder, as if the student had been simply attacked with a knife, stabbed dozens of times, and left in the forest. The police did find evidence of a struggle, but no definitive proof was found. Most importantly, there was no murder weapon, which greatly complicated the search for the perpetrator. Authorities believed they were dealing with a psychopath who had an intense rage against the girl. The nature and number of wounds suggested that the murderer was in a psychotic state, just striking without feeling anything, until Louise no longer showed any signs of life. They also believed this rage was not random, but possibly based on personal motives. Investigators began to take a closer look at the young victim's immediate surroundings. She was naturally modest and quiet, never getting involved with bad company or dangerous people. She had no dependencies on addictive substances. Louise also had no mental health issues. She did not run away from home and had never thought of taking her own life. In fact, there were no potentially dangerous people in the girl's immediate surrounding. The girl came from a wealthy, respected family. Her parents also had no problems with the law or the neighborhood. Investigators decided to talk again with her friends, who were 12 and 13 years old at the time. They hoped the girls might have noticed something suspicious, perhaps seeing Louise leave and being watched by someone. But the children saw nothing and no one. This interaction was not in vain, however. After meeting with the police, their fear seemed to grow with each passing moment. Finally, one of the girls could no longer endure the question and practically screamed that they were the ones who had stabbed Louise. Then she covered her face with her hands and cried. The news was so shocking that even the police officers thought it was a bad joke, but the girl assured them it was true. She sobbed and apologized to her parents. In a normal situation, the police officers would have immediately arrested someone who had confessed to stabbing a child 30 times. In this case, however, it was children aged 12 and 13 who had taken up weapons and, under the law, could not be prosecuted. The students, as well as the local community, were shocked by the news. After conversations with the children, parents, and lawyers, the girl's confession was confirmed. Her friend also confessed. The two offenders detailed what had happened. According to the girls, they had indeed bullied their old friend for several months over previous minor disagreement. The students were angry when Louise told a teacher about the incident. They thought they could get away with such behavior, but after Louise's complaints, they feared their parents would be called to the school. So on the same day, they decided to take revenge on the girl and eliminate her, so that Louise could no longer complain to anyone. The older girl decided it was worth inviting Louise to a visit under the pretense of reconciliation. This way, they could gain her trust and lure her away from the protection of adults. It would settle things once and for all. As a murder weapon, the older girl took a kitchen knife. When the victim took the bait and came to visit, the girls initially lulled the gullible peer's vigilance. They drank tea and watched some videos on the internet. Everything seemed fine. When Louise then wanted to go home, the older classmate offered to walk with her and accompany her through the forest. In her opinion, this was a shorter way to Louise's house. The three had nothing to fear and could continue talking. Louise naively agreed. This was the last time she was seen alive by the parents of the student she visited. According to the adults, this happened around 5:30 p.m. The girls left the house together and moved away to avoid accidental witnesses. Then the friends accused the protagonist of the story of betrayal. The argument escalated quickly, and all three began to quarrel. The offended children lost their temper. Then the younger girl grabbed the victim, put a plastic bag over her head, and hit her with a stone. This wound did not kill the student. She began to resist, but the older girl did not relent, grabbed Louise, and began stabbing her with a knife. After the attack, the teenagers left their peer. According to them, she was still alive, but probably not for long. The girl lost consciousness and bled heavily, with no one to help her. Though she soon died. The investigators believed the attack was too brutal for the children. The girls came from simple families and had not previously had problems with the law, making it seem impossible for them to have committed such a brutal murder. Initially, it was suspected that an older third teenager was involved, holding the knife. However, the two girls repeatedly insisted that no one else was with them and that they had killed their friend. Only when the knife was found could fingerprints and DNA be compared on the murder weapon. The girls admitted that they had discarded the weapon nearby in the forest, but could not remember the exact location. They managed to reach the old train station with their victim, where the body was later found. Kitchen knife was discarded not far from this place. The searchers combed the entire area, but the police could not find the valuable piece of evidence. According to the murderer, it was a large knife, an important piece of evidence in the case, as it would have shown who had it at the time of the murder. The police still believed the girls were lying and hoped to identify a third person whose DNA prints or fingerprints were on the handle. However, the children continued to insist that they had committed the murder. Forensic pathologists and forensic experts were informed. The forensic examination revealed 30 stab wounds inflicted on Louise in the abdomen, back, chest, and neck. She resisted as long as she could and then fell to the ground from blood loss. After that, her classmates inflicted several more stab wounds on her. The examination found DNA traces of only 3 people at the scene of the crime: the victim herself and the 2 confessing students. Ultimately, the police accepted the girls' statements as true and found no evidence of another person's involvement. According to German law, one is only criminally responsible from the age of 14, so none of those involved in the murder could be arrested and punished. However, the collected materials were handed over to the Youth Welfare Office, which was to work with the young murderers. The school attended by the girls opened on Monday. Child psychologists worked on-site to provide the frightened students with the necessary help and support. The psychologists worked at the educational institution for 3 days. During this time, no classes took place, and the specialists spoke with some students who were shocked by the events. Joint sessions were also held in the classroom. The psychologists helped the teachers understand and respond to the children's reaction. Even after 3 days, the psychologists continued to talk to the students. Then, classes resumed without changes to the program. As a sign of mourning, the national flag was lowered throughout the city. On March 22nd, the 12-year-old victim of the brutal massacre was buried at the request of the parents at the place where the body was found. A memorial was erected where many city residents gathered. Surprisingly, perpetrators felt no great remorse. Although they cried at the police station, they quickly came to their senses and showed no remorse for their action. The girls cold-bloodedly committed a premeditated massacre and posted videos of a dance on their TikTok accounts the next day. Later, their accounts were deleted due to numerous complaints. They interacted with peers as if the murder was normal for them. It is known that they were separated from their families for some time and taken to the youth department, where psychologists and psychiatrists worked with the teenagers. It was also necessary to find out if the children had mental disabilities that led to the tragic outcome. Perhaps they needed treatment. According to the country's legislation, they would not be held responsible for their actions in this situation. The prosecutor's office closed the investigation and the case after determining that the children had indeed killed their classmate themselves. There was no reason to suspect a third person of committing the massacre. The chief prosecutor said at a press conference that the perpetrators should be protected because they were still children and emotions played an important role in this case. The shocked parents of the murdered girl were beside themselves with grief and disbelief at this decision. They could not believe that such a brutal murder of their daughter by monsters could go unpunished. Thanks to their outrage and commitment, this shocking case of child cruelty became the talk of the town. All of this led to a debate about the inadequacy of the German legal system, which not only allows such cases, but is also completely powerless to punish the perpetrators. Public dissatisfaction was so great that the families of the young murderers were eventually forced to leave the city. Parents of the girls were constantly harassed by the local population, who were outraged by the situation and feared living near the murderers and their families. The neighbors began openly threatening the parents of the disturbed children, so the families of the murderers left their homes for safety reasons. Their children, however, are still in a state institution, and their parents remain in contact with them. In reality, parents of the murderers are the only ones seriously affected by their children's atrocity. The girls had already been taken from them for some time, and there is a possibility they may never return to their family. They might be placed in a juvenile home or given to foster parents. For a long time, nothing was known about this, as Germany has very strict laws protecting the privacy of even the most violent criminals and their families, let alone children, especially in such complex cases as the murder of a schoolgirl. For the same reason, their real names and photos are not published. Psychologists and psychiatrists have been working with the perpetrators for a long time, and no mental disabilities have been found in the children, making the brutality of the attack even more shocking. It was a heinous crime. The children killed cold-bloodedly and deliberately, armed with a knife, lured Louise into a trap, and then brutally slaughtered her. All this happened solely out of revenge, which the students confirmed to the police. Many experts began to look for the culprits for this tragedy, which unleashed a whole wave of negativity and hatred toward the parents, the girls. Thanks to the current German law, they could simply change their names and now live in a place where no one knows about their connection to the brutal murder of the girl or even suspects that they might be dangerous. The incident has sparked a wave of protests and discussions across the country. In general, according to a number of experts, the number of crimes, including particularly serious ones involving minors, is increasing every year in Germany. Many more cases have become known, such as the case of the teenager from Wunsdorf. Both were 14 years old and went to the same class. In this case, one of the boys had been bullied for years, and finally, he killed the other boy with a blunt object in the summer of 2022. Another shocking case occurred when 13 and 14-year-old classmates strangled their friend. Indeed, serious crimes are also committed by younger children. The number of such cases involving minors exceeds a dozen each year in Germany alone. All this causes great concern throughout the country, especially since these cases seem to be the most shocking for the families and friends of both the victims and the perpetrators, who have gone astray even before graduating from school. The incidents are extremely traumatizing. The waves of indignation have not subsided to this day. An initiative group has launched a petition calling for changes to the legislation and a reduction in the age of criminal responsibility. In the first days, it was signed by more than 40,000 people. Some experts believe that violence on television and in video games is to blame for the problem, which could be a trigger. Statistics experts have analyzed a large number of games and TV shows with violent scenes and concluded that all this initially imposes violent models that encourage young people to solve problems with violence. Given their fragile psyche, the situation is further exacerbated. Some experts believe that control over such issues should be entirely in the hands of the state and that the process of a child's upbringing should be monitored. There is also a radical opinion that the community system should be responsible for raising children, as parents cannot always ensure the full development of a person. According to local residents, the parents of the murderers are to blame for this massacre because they raised them poorly. Perhaps they were completely indifferent to the children's lives or treated them cruelly. All this contributed to the children deciding that the best way out was to kill a former friend. It is impossible to know for sure what the environment was like in which the students grew up. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.
If you want to succeed in your career, you have to move forward confidently and reach new heights. But don't forget the simple rule: nothing comes for free, because an offer that's too generous can actually lead not to success but to death, as happened to Lynn. On September 4, 1991, in Catworth, southeast London, United Kingdom, Mr. Rogers reported his daughter missing to the police. 17-year-old Lynn Rogers had disappeared. She was due to return home after a brief interview scheduled for the morning. She was planning to take a job and was due to meet with her employer to discuss the key points of the upcoming job. Her relatives were waiting for news from Lynn. She had to travel quite a distance but had promised to call soon. But 12 hours after her departure, there was still no news from her. Worryingly, the phone number she left didn't work. Her father became worried and contacted the police. Very little was known about her. Lynn Rogers lived with her father and sister. Most of her daily life revolved around her beloved hobby. She had a horse in the stable. She never missed a visit to her animal. Naturally, she changed her plans that day. The police analyzed the missing person's personal life and social environment. Lynn was a very quiet, well-behaved girl, not prone to runaways, with no mental health issues, no addictions, and no connections to the criminal world. She hadn't had any recent romantic relationships. She was focused on her work, wanting to save enough money to get an education and build a life for herself. Lynn had no former problematic boyfriends who might have posed a threat. It seemed as if what happened was related to her trip to a job interview. The girl was very ambitious and wanted to pursue a career. Her main goal was the tourism industry. Despite her young age, Lynn had been working part-time for some time at a company that sold travel products. Shortly before her disappearance, she lost her job because the company closed. The girl didn't want to sit idle and planned to become self-sufficient, so she immediately began analyzing promising job opportunities. Within a few weeks, Lynn sent more than 60 resumes to various companies. Most of them were concentrated in southeast London, as it was the easiest area to reach. As is often the case, most of the resumes went unanswered, but a few employers responded. One man even much more interesting offer than all the others. The young woman immediately focused on him. He introduced himself as a pilot and owner of a private airline. He was very interested in her resume and called Lynn 4 times at home. The pilot offered her the position of flight attendant on a small private plane for businessmen. The job involved accompanying wealthy citizens on flights within Europe. The employer promised a high salary, about £15,000 a month, which seemed much more generous than the expectations of a 17-year-old girl. She considered this a great stroke of luck and believed that the new job would be a real breakthrough for her future career. Lynn was so excited that she ignored all of her father's concerns. The man was skeptical about such a lucrative offer, as Lynn had no experience as a flight attendant. Why was she immediately offered such a position when a more experienced candidate could have been hired? But her daughter was able to calm him down and convince him that everything was fine. However, Lynn's father's suspicions were not unfounded. As the authorities discovered, she was supposed to meet her employer at a train station near her home. The pilot was then supposed to take her to a small airport in Sussex. There they were to transfer to a helicopter and fly to a larger airport, where a private plane was waiting to show the young woman her workplace and all the working conditions. Such a long journey seemed too long to discuss only the upcoming job. This made her father even more suspicious, as everything could have been discussed in an office. But Lynn remained adamant. She clung to the offer and had no intention of backing down. The more the investigative team discovered about the upcoming trip and the flights, the greater their concern became. Everything seemed strange and out of character for a normal job interview, as if the employer wanted to confuse everyone and had therefore hatched such a complicated plan. Particularly suspicious was the fact that the private airline pilot insisted on taking all the documents with him before flying to the meeting. The police spoke with Lynn's younger sister. The girl had received several calls from this suspicious man while he was trying to reach her sister. She confirmed that she had heard airplane noises in the background during the calls. The clear signal for takeoff was clearly audible, Flight 101. For some reason, this sentence stuck in her mind. After speaking with the young woman's family, investigators tried to track down Lynn but quickly lost track. It was unclear where she was, whether she had traveled abroad or was being held in the UK against her will. There was no activity whatsoever. The passport she was required to take with her was never used. She had not crossed the border. The investigation team could not say whether she was alive or dead. This gave her relatives hope. Lynn's father appeared on television and appealed to the public for help. They tried to involve as many people as possible in the investigation, but most of the tips the police received were useless. In the days that followed, Lynn Rogers's disappearance became national news. Volunteer teams and police officers joined the search and circulated photos of the young woman. Initially, transport hubs, train stations, and airports were searched. All people who had been in these locations at the time of the young woman's disappearance were interviewed. Thus, the first important witness emerged, reporting that he had gone to a telephone booth at a train station in Sussex to make a phone call. The booth was occupied by a man who was discussing a strange topic. The witness overheard the conversation by chance. The information relayed almost completely matched the job offer Lynn had received. It also mentioned a high salary, helicopter rides, and flights across Europe. The man was holding a device that imitated airplane noises. It all looked strange and didn't sound like a typical job offer. The choice of location and circumstances, the man's behavior, and even the date the conversation was overheard led the police to suspect that this man could be the mysterious pilot of a private airline. On that very day, the unknown man contacted the young woman again. Unfortunately, in 1991, there were major problems gathering information. There was no advanced video surveillance on the streets, and people didn't yet use mobile phones. Therefore, the only source of information was a telephone booth. The task force's only option was to send several detectives to the location indicated by the witness. The phone booth was searched from top to bottom, and a huge amount of fingerprints and traces were secured. At least 20 or even 30 people had been there in those few days. This helped little, however, as there were no suspects yet. There was nothing to compare the fingerprints with. DNA analysis options were also very limited in the early 1990s. Furthermore, there was the possibility that the kidnappers' traces had been erased by other people and no trace remained at all. In any case, they acted quickly. They hoped Lynn Rogers was still alive. 5 days after her disappearance, a body was found 50 kilometers from her hometown. A hunter was walking through a dense forest in Rotherfield, East Sussex. The man noticed a suspicious pile of branches in a bramble, beneath which he discovered the body of a young woman lying face down. The man immediately alerted the police. The inquest determined that the victim had been lying there for several days. She was fully clothed but without any personal belongings. The deceased's identity could not be established because she had no identification. A detailed examination was required. The body was brought to the coroner's table. At the time, several missing persons cases were being investigated, but investigators immediately suspected that the missing person might be Lynn. After visual examination, the coroner discovered only one notable detail: a scar on her left knee. This feature matched that of the missing Lynn Rogers. Based on the dental records, the deceased was positively identified as Lynn. From that moment on, the search and rescue operation was transformed into a homicide investigation. It was clear that the girl's death had not been accidental. While investigating the cause of 17-year-old Lynn's death, the coroner discovered signs of strangulation. In addition to significant bruising on her neck, numerous capillary ruptures were noted on her face, including in her eyes, which also indicated suffocation. The motive for the attack may have been rape, but no such marks were found on the victim's body. The abrasions on her chin were incomprehensible, but on the first day the coroner couldn't determine their origin. The next day it dawned on him. The expert recognized them as human bite marks. Aside from being a frightening sign, the suspected perpetrator's dental marks could be a valuable clue, as each person leaves unique bite marks. The suspect's footprints had to be compared with the killer's print. However, there was a problem: there were no suspects yet. Unfortunately, this didn't provide any concrete clues to the perpetrator. It was still unclear whether the employer with the generous offer for Lynn had anything to do with it, and in which direction the investigation should go. The investigators decided to revisit all available sources of information. They began by interviewing Lynn's sister. From her alone, they collected about 95 pages of biographical data about the girl. Although statistics show that half of this information is useless, it is necessary to gather it to understand who the victim might have come into contact with. In this case, this was very time-consuming. The search for witnesses continued at the transport hubs the girl might have visited. They traced her route from the moment she left the house on the day of her disappearance. This led to the emergence of another interesting witness, who turned out to be a London taxi driver. On the day the girl disappeared, he was waiting for his next customer at Charing Cross Station. There he saw an attractive young woman who looked very elegant. He couldn't take his eyes off her. He was so impressed by her appearance. Had prepared meticulously for this interview. She had applied beautiful makeup and put on her best dress to fit the image of a flight attendant. According to the taxi driver's description, this woman's appearance matched Lynn's. She simply stood there waiting for someone until a blue car pulled up, into which she got. Later, during the investigation, the man recognized her when he saw a photo of the missing woman in the newspaper. It turned out that this taxi driver from Charing Cross was the last person to see the girl alive. He couldn't identify the car exactly. He didn't have the license plate number or the make or the driver's face, but he was able to give the police initial clues. Fortunately for the investigators, this taxi driver had a good memory. The unusual color of the car was very clearly imprinted in his memory. Charts of standard colors were compiled and shown to him. The witness analyzed the colors of the existing car makes, which narrowed the list down to a rare car model. The taxi driver also reported that the driver of the vehicle was wearing a pilot's uniform, which also proved to be an important clue. This confirmed the investigators' suspicion that the employer was involved in the murder. Law enforcement then decided to talk again with the first witness who had seen the suspect in the phone booth. He repeated his story, but now the investigators were interested in the details. As it turned out, the first witness had noticed that the man had taken a recording device out of the phone booth and turned it on during the conversation. According to Lynn's sister, this could have been recorded aircraft noises from the airport, exactly the takeoff clearance for Flight 101. The man also remembered that the suspect was holding a piece of paper that looked like a resume. This is how investigators learned that the suspected hijacker had somehow obtained Lynn's resume, including a photo and recommendations. Investigators then returned to the victim's family, hoping to complete the list of companies to which she had sent her application documents. A notebook was found in her room in which she had listed over 300 companies that interested her. As far as was known, she had sent 60 resumes to various companies, including her address and phone number. The next step was to determine which of them had received the resume and who might be using it. Lynn's sister also helped save time. When the girl had a brief conversation with the mysterious employer, he explained that he had received the resume at an office in Greenwich. In the deceased woman's notebook, there was only one entry for an organization at this address. It was called Africa Hinterland. Interestingly, this organization was no longer active in the aviation sector at that time. It had closed down. The police officers went to the office center where the airline's branch had previously been located. There was a central office there that received and forwarded mail. There was a separate compartment for closed companies which contained all mail addressed to Africa Hinterland. Lynn's resume was supposed to be among them, but they couldn't find it. One of the office center employees came to their aid. The man remembered that on one of the days when Africa Hinterland was closed, a man came here and introduced himself as an employee of the company. He remembered him because he had never seen him before the company closed. He looked too strange and had driven a blue car. The office center employee couldn't identify the exact make, but the description matched the color of the car the witness, a taxi driver at the train station, had seen. The man driving this car gained access to the airline's mailbox and took several documents. Lynn's CV was likely among them. A new witness from the business center was able to provide investigators with even more valuable information. He had found out the man's name. This was necessary in order to hand over the documents to him. This led to the prime suspect, a 36-year-old man named Scott Singleton. However, the witness's statement was not enough. The investigators continued their investigation. They managed to find a parking ticket that had been issued in Scott's name that day. This allowed them to link the information. The man was observed, and it turned out that he had made the call from a payphone. This provided two crucial matches. The police then took a closer look at Scott Singleton's background. He was a 35-year-old bachelor. He had been divorced long before these events and had 2 children whom he saw regularly. It turned out that he had a criminal record, not for serious crimes, however, but only for some minor offenses for which he had been fined. It was strange that he had so suddenly gone from minor offenses to a brutal murder. On September 28, 1991, investigators concluded they had sufficient evidence to arrest Scott. With the prime suspect behind bars, the police had more opportunities to test their suspicions. After obtaining the search warrant, a search of his home was carried out. There they found a pilot's uniform and a transmitter that operated on several of the airline's frequencies. It was assumed that this device made it possible to imitate the noise of the airport or control tower when he called Lynn Rogers. The black fibers found on the victim's clothing matched the fibers found in Scott's home and on the passenger seat of his car. Scott did indeed own a blue car, which the taxi driver had described. Other suspicious items were found, indicating Scott Singleton's increased interest in airlines. However, it was unclear why he pretended to be a pilot and led a double life. The prime suspect had two wives, his ex-wife Pet and his current girlfriend Kim. Both believed he was a qualified pilot. In reality, he had no training or solo flight experience. His only connection to aviation was that he had once taken flying lessons at an airfield. However, he hadn't completed this training either. But why he surrounded himself with lies and cheated on all the women around him remained a mystery. In any case, he used special technical means to deceive Lynn Rogers, making her believe he was a true expert in the aviation industry. However, suspicions remain that he had access to the control tower, which allowed him to make the relevant recording and play it back when he called the woman. Although the criminal managed to deceive everyone around him, it was more difficult for investigators to convict him. Scott did not admit to any connection with Lynn. He denied ever having been to Rotherfield, where the body was found. The arrested man provided an alibi, stating that on the day of the disappearance, he met with his ex-wife to see his children and upon his return spent time with his girlfriend, Kim. When police contacted his current and ex-girlfriends to confirm or refute the alibi, both initially confirmed Scott's statement. However, they were unable to provide any further information about what else had happened that day or what they had done. Both were unable to answer a single question and behaved suspiciously. The longer the investigators spoke with them, the shakier their conviction in these statements seemed. They both quickly admitted that Scott hadn't been with them that day. He had been absent practically from morning to night, and the next day he met with both of them and convinced them to tell the police he had been with them. They agreed to stick to his story. It was all a lie, even this man's real name was Andre Reich, which he had changed to Scott Singleton. The prosecution gave the investigative team only 36 hours from Scott's arrest to gather all the key evidence and file charges. However, the chain of lies was so convoluted that this time might not be enough. A key piece of the puzzle was a bite mark. An impression of Scott Singleton's teeth had to be taken to compare it with the marks on the victim's chin. It's not surprising that he refused to take a print. Without this important evidence, no charges could be brought against him, and without his consent, it was impossible to take a print. The remaining evidence was indirect, so the man had to be released. Another valuable source of information could have been the blue car Scott used to pick up Lynn on the day of her abduction and murder. Such a car was indeed registered to Scott, but by that time it had already disappeared. Investigators continued to circulate a wanted notice with the vehicle's details. Regular calls and reports came into the police, but almost all turned out to be false or even malicious, as they required additional time for verification. However, there was no other way to obtain valuable information. Finally, a man contacted the police who had seen a vehicle matching the description in Rotherfield. It was parked in a dark side street not far from where Lynn's body had been found in the woods. After the car had been standing still for several days, the man wrote down the make and license plate number. After an inspection, it turned out to be Scott's. The found car made it possible to prove the perpetrator's lie. He could finally be connected to the crime scene. Now the connection to the body had to be confirmed. The fingerprints from the phone booth did not match Scott's, but this did not prove his innocence, as the phone booth had been used by many other callers and the perpetrator's fingerprints could simply have been wiped off. The connection to the body could only be confirmed by a dental impression. Unfortunately, at that time there were no computer records or photos available through the health database. Therefore, law enforcement authorities began contacting dentists in Scott's neighborhood directly and manually searching for all the information. This was a very laborious and time-consuming task. There was a risk that the information might not be found at all. Nothing prevented the suspect from introducing himself to doctors under a different name. Eventually, they managed to find an X-ray of Scott's teeth in his dental chart. However, all of this proved useless. In the case of the marks on Lynn's body, a plaster cast was required. Such models have a limited shelf life. They aren't kept forever, so the cast might have been destroyed. Police eventually located a dentist who had treated Scott Singleton. He confirmed that the dental impression needed to be preserved. This allowed a comparison to the bite mark on Lynn Rogers's chin. The forensic pathologist who conducted this analysis was certain that the mark on the victim's body was made by the suspect. The mark matched his dentures exactly, including the unique characteristics of the injuries and wear. Finally, the investigative team had all the information they needed to make another arrest on October 10 and charge 36-year-old Scott. The prosecution assumed that the perpetrator had discovered Lynn's resume by chance when he visited his company's workshop and saw the airline's mail. He immediately liked the young woman. He quickly discovered that Lynn lived not far from his current girlfriend, Kim, and he often visited the area. He probably even observed his victim. The man was interested and wanted to start a relationship with Lynn. He lured her to a meeting under false pretenses. The girl probably saw through his lie and rejected him during the meeting when she realized that he was not a pilot and that the job offer was just a lure. The girl may have reacted violently to the deception. Scott did not rape her but feared to be discovered, so he beat her, strangled her, and then hid the body. The perpetrator continued to deny his guilt. Therefore, it was unclear where exactly the young woman had been murdered. Had he attacked her in the car or taken her to the woods and strangled her there? Only the perpetrator himself could confirm or refute these suspicions. While the prosecution prepared for trial, the investigation into the suspect continued in the hope of finding the missing facts. The final piece of the puzzle was about to emerge. The version they settled on was that Lynn had seen through Scott's lies. The murderer didn't want to leave a witness alive who could completely destroy his invented world. He was distraught that his plan had failed. Investigators knew that during a conversation with Lynn, the signal for takeoff for Flight 101 could be heard in the background. It was assumed that a special radio scanner was used for this. But Scott's girlfriend, Kim, was willing to tell the authorities even more. She contacted investigators after her boyfriend had already been arrested and handed them a cassette tape containing Scott's test recordings. She had found it in their shared apartment. Scott had made several recordings while posing as an air traffic controller. The perpetrator used his own voice to make these recordings, deceiving his victim and luring them into a trap. This was the crucial evidence heard by the deceased sister. The girl confirmed that this exact sound had been heard in the background during the phone call. Scott's girlfriend, Kim, also testified against him in court, which was very damaging to him. She was able to expose the defendant's lies, which she herself had long believed. Kim described the killer as a skilled con artist, manipulator, and extremely dangerous person. In reality, Scott had neither a prestigious job in the aviation industry nor a high salary nor the opportunities for advancement and international travel that he so loved to talk about. The murderer's trial was very emotional. The 37-year-old defendant was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1992. After the verdict was announced, the deceased Lynn's father attempted to attack him. 3 police officers restrained the 55-year-old Mr. Rogers, who was shouting that he was going to kill Scott. The man declared that he would find him no matter what and take revenge for what he had done to him and his daughter. Despite all these difficult moments, the killer insisted that he was innocent. During the final stages of the trial, the lawyer stated that he would appeal the verdict. However, the prosecutor insisted that he would fight to ensure that the verdict was not overturned. Prosecution and Lynn's family believed that a correct and just decision had been made. Based on the evidence gathered, Scott was a brutal, calculating killer who clearly posed a danger to society and would commit further similar crimes if he remained outside bars. Although the case can be considered closed, many questions remain. First and foremost, the motive was unclear and seemed too weak. Could something greater have led to the death? Also disturbing was the abrupt transition from minor offenses to the brutal murder committed by the perpetrator. People don't usually become murderers out of nowhere. The severity of their crimes increases gradually. Therefore, suspicions persisted that Scott might have additional victims. However, this version of events could neither be proven nor disproven. In any case, he continued to maintain his innocence and declared that he would fight for his freedom until the end. However, all his appeals have been rejected, and he remains behind bars. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.
Sometimes it's hard to keep your emotions in check, especially when events keep happening over the course of several years that throw you off track. But can a carefully planned murder be considered a loss of control? Joanna Simpson was born in 1964. Her wealthy family lived in Yorkshire, UK, where she spent most of her childhood. Joanna attended an all-girls primary school and completed several grades before the family decided to relocate. The Simpsons moved to Laxey on the Isle of Man after her father sold his construction company. After graduating from the local school, Joanna attended Oxford High School and then studied business administration at university. She was quite popular among her peers. Joanna was a well-mannered, friendly, and optimistic girl who liked to help everyone she got along with. This attracted people, so she was always surrounded by a lively group of classmates. They enjoyed spending time with her. Of course, there were also young men in this group who were hoping for her attention. Nevertheless, Joanna was focused on her work and career and wanted to establish a secure life before starting a family. She decided to get married in 1994 when she turned 30. Her husband also came from a wealthy family. Joanna and her husband bought a huge house in Ascot. It was in a dilapidated state and needed renovations to make it livable. At the time, the couple had no children, so choosing such a large house seemed excessive to some. They lived just the two of them near Windsor, home to the royal family castle. Legoland was also nearby, so their chosen location seemed like a good option for expanding the family. However, Joanna was in no hurry to do so. She planned to convert part of the house into a guest house so that relatives and friends could visit more often. Her husband supported her but also wanted to have children. It seemed like a loving relationship, but after 3 years of marriage, her husband decided to separate from her. It seemed as if this was all due to her lack of desire to have children. Joanna was devastated by this decision. Her friends, noticing how depressed she was, wanted to help her. One of her close friends was working as a senior flight attendant at the time. She had a flight planned to South Africa. The young woman suggested that her friend fly with her, hoping that a change of scenery would help her recover, and she agreed. As it turned out, this decision was fateful because during the flight, Joanna met a man named Robert Brown. He was a pilot for British Airways and was flying the plane she and her friend were traveling on. The man loved running and was a 3-time British cross-country champion, something he was very proud of. They seemed to have a lot in common, and so a romantic relationship began. Joanna retained the right to the house from her first marriage, as she had invested a large portion of the funds in it. Shortly after returning from Africa, she and her new lover moved in together. As early as September 1998, they began thinking about marriage. The man proposed at Christmas. Everything happened very quickly. Joanna was usually much more cautious, but not this time. After their engagement in February 1999, they exchanged vows. This haste surprised many, even the young woman's parents, who had only seen Robert a few times up to that point. The man did not make a good impression on them. They considered him too arrogant and believed he was incapable of giving their daughter love. However, it was pointless to try to dissuade Joanna. She was independent and old enough to make such decisions. The only thing the young woman's parents could do was persuade her to draw up a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. The Simpsons believed this relationship could end quickly and did not want their daughter to worry about divorce and risk losing part of their fortune. Just over 20 people attended the wedding. The newlyweds didn't want to draw too much attention to themselves or have an overly pompous celebration. After the ceremony, the couple immediately traveled to the country where they had met South Africa. Joanna hoped to spend an unforgettable honeymoon there, but within the first few days of the trip, she began to doubt the correctness of her decision. Robert behaved so arrogantly toward the hotel staff that she herself felt uncomfortable. Until that moment, she had never experienced such rude behavior from her lover. Even before returning from her honeymoon, Joanna called her mother and expressed her concerns that she was doubting her decision. Realizing that she hadn't gotten to know Robert well enough, Joanna watched with horror as she observed her husband's behavior during the honeymoon. She feared that his rudeness would soon be directed at her as well. Although Joanna considered her decision a mistake, the young woman did not separate from Robert immediately upon returning from South Africa. Instead, the thought occurred to her that she could change this man. This decision was likely related to the pregnancy Joanna discovered upon her return. Like most women, she thought that the birth of the child would help her husband become more attentive and caring when he became a father. However, Robert seemed determined to dash her best hopes. Instead of softening when he learned that his wife was pregnant and that she would find it difficult to leave him, he became even more rude and arrogant. His behavior now also extended to her family and friends. Nevertheless, Joanna did not want a divorce, fearing that the child would have no father, which would pose a major problem. When Alex was born, the situation changed little. A few months later, Joanna became pregnant again, and Katie was born, but the second child also had no effect on Robert's behavior. However, he did not physically harm his wife at that time, which may have also prevented the couple from separating. But all of her relatives and friends noticed how much he traumatized her psychologically. The man was extremely toxic and rude to her relatives and friends. Everyone saw how much this hurt Joanna. The longer they were together, the more obvious the difference between these people became. It was so obvious they were so different that they shouldn't be together at all. Joanna herself was aware of this, but the children prevented her from separating. After the birth of her first child, she repeatedly declared that the marriage would eventually break down and divorce was inevitable. She held on as long as she could, but after 8 years, she realized it couldn't go on. She made the final decision after her husband shared his dark thoughts with her. He had considered killing her and the children with an axe, and then taking his own life in an airplane. The woman was very frightened and filed for divorce in 2007. From that moment on, Robert's behavior deteriorated even further. He began to openly express how much he hated their relatives and his wife. He also began to manipulate her, hinting that he might take his own life. When that didn't work, He began to subtly hint that he might harm Joanna and her children. The woman didn't even know whether to take his words seriously or whether they were just attempts at manipulation. She believed that Robert had made it all up so that she would withdraw the divorce. The husband told his friends that he didn't want to increase the distance between himself and his children. Due to his job, which involved air travel, he was often abroad for several weeks and had very little time for his children. Despite Robert's negative attitude towards the separation, he was unable to change his behavior in order to convince Joanna to reconsider her decision to divorce. For the first few months after filing for divorce, they lived together. However, something suddenly happened that convinced them of the correctness of their decision. One evening, after the couple had put the children to bed, another argument broke out between them. Robert accused his wife of cheating on him, but this was untrue. Such accusations regularly came from his mouth, but they were always unfounded, as Joanna devoted herself entirely to her children. She didn't even have time to find another man or have affairs. The woman tried to justify herself, but it seemed pointless. The argument took place in the kitchen. At one point, Robert grabbed a knife, approached her, pressed the blade to her throat, and declared that he was going to kill her. Although the situation was critical, the victim of the aggression remained calm. In a calm voice, Joanna explained that there was no point in killing her, as her husband knew very well what a good mother she was. If he killed her, he would deprive the children of both their parents. Joanna emphasized that if Robert were to commit a spontaneous act of violence, he would hardly be able to avoid prison. Finally, they managed to convince the domestic tyrant to put down the knife. The very day after the incident, Joanna told her mother and some friends everything. Everyone agreed that she absolutely had to report the incident to the police, as such things could not be ignored. Everyone had noticed that Robert's behavior had become erratic and dangerous since filing for divorce. The woman feared that an arrest could have a very negative impact on the children and did not want to subject them to this stress. Joanna believed that the situation would resolve itself, as after this outburst of aggression, she had spoken to her husband again and made it clear to him that there could be no resumption of the relationship, after which he had accepted it. Joanna now begged Robert to move out of their house, as she believed that continuing to live together could be dangerous for everyone. Unfortunately, this had no effect on the husband. He declared that he had no intention of moving. The husband enjoyed living in a large house and leading a luxurious life. He was then offered money to buy an apartment, but he remained firm. Many believed he was waiting for a better financial offer, as Joanna came from a wealthy family. He was offered increasingly larger sums several times in a row. Finally, it worked, and Robert moved out. Joanna could finally breathe a sigh of relief. She no longer felt her safety threatened. The couple shared custody of the children. The wife was waiting for the divorce to be finalized when a heated argument suddenly erupted over the division of the house. Despite the prenuptial agreement, Robert had no intention of relinquishing his property. Unfortunately, the former spouses were forced to maintain contact to coordinate visits with their son and daughter. Joanna tried by all means to show that a resumption of her relationship with Robert was out of the question, so that he wouldn't try to woo her. It seemed to work. They lived separately. Robert even began a relationship with another woman, a flight attendant from his work. Sometime after the relationship began, she became pregnant. Joanna considered this good news and hoped that the relationship with another woman and her pregnancy would make Robert forget her. But she was very wrong. On November 1, 2010, a man contacted the local police station. From the beginning, he behaved very secretively, not wanting to say too much, but giving a veiled account of an incident. He chose his words carefully but still wanted to come to the police station to report something that had happened shortly before that day. He categorically refused to allow the police to come to his home, claiming to have children to care for and not wanting to cause them any unnecessary inconvenience. The suspect introduced himself as Robert Brown. Around the same time the man contacted the police, a close friend of Joanna's received a call from the school her children attended. This happened on the same day Robert contacted the authorities. Joanna's children were absent from school, and their teachers tried to call their mother to find out the reason, but no one responded. They then reached their friend, but she did not know exactly where Joanna was. The October holidays had just ended in English schools, and pupils were staying home for a week. Alex and Katie were spending this time with their biological father. Joanna was planning to fly to the Isle of Man to visit her parents, so it was unclear when the woman had disappeared. What had happened to the children? They were 8 and 9 years old, so everyone was worried. After the call from the school, Joanna's friend contacted her mother. The woman explained that her daughter was due to return to Ascot after her trip to the Isle of Man. She hadn't spoken to her on the day of her return, but after the call, the mother became anxious and tried to reach her daughter. To her horror, she received no response. Afterward, she called her friend again. Unable to locate Joanna, they decided to contact the police. By that time, Robert had already requested a meeting with the police. After comparing these two statements, the investigators decided to go to the missing woman's house to verify their worst fears. There was no one there, and no one responded to the persistent knocking, so the police officers decided to break down the door to gain entry. Once inside, they immediately noticed suspicious stains in the hallway that looked like blood. The search yielded no results. Joanna was not found. There was no one in the house at all, including the children. The police officers had to return to the station empty-handed. Now they waited for Robert to show up for the agreed meeting. When the man arrived, however, he refused to answer the police's questions about his wife. His behavior seemed very strange. He was the one who had called the police and requested a meeting, but now he refused to provide any information. Since Joanna was still missing, it was decided to arrest Robert. They decided to conduct a more thorough search of the missing woman's house, which was located on a fairly large property. As long as what had happened remained a mystery, they hesitated to press charges against the man. The authorities began to examine the entire property and, at the same time, spoke with Joanna's family members. Everyone stated that the woman could not have disappeared spontaneously and had no intention of leaving and taking her children with her. However, all of the missing woman's relatives spoke negatively about Robert and believed that only he could have had anything to do with Joanna's disappearance. On the first day of the search, the only information that could be confirmed was that Robert had taken the children to his brother's house. The missing people's relatives were at least reassured by the fact that Alex and Katie were safe. On November 2, 2010, Robert was interrogated again. Each time, they attempted to question him about the events of October 31, but to almost all questions, he replied, "No comment." The police then decided to change their tactics and talk to the man about everyday things. He immediately became animated and readily explained how much he enjoyed jogging. But as soon as the subject turned to Joanna, he became withdrawn and nervous. The man spoke quite openly about his relationship and married life with this woman, but emphasized how bad she was, called her a spoiled child, and tried by all means to portray her in a negative light. He constantly mentioned that Joanna and her family had no money problems and did not know how difficult it was to earn money. At the end of this conversation, the police had the impression that he only hated them because the Simpsons were richer than him. Robert himself came from a humble family living in Edinburgh. His father worked at the port, and his mother was a bank clerk. They didn't have major financial problems and could easily make a living, but they were far from the financial prosperity of Joanna's family. Robert himself was a pilot and earned about $150,000 a year, so he had no particular reason to complain. Nevertheless, he continued to express his dissatisfaction with all of this. The investigators talked with Robert for quite a long time about abstract topics. The man was very talkative, but when asked about Joanna and the events of October 31, he again replied that he didn't want to comment on them. To the investigator's surprise, Robert explained that he felt a kind of blockage, as if his mind prevented him from answering such questions. No matter how hard the investigators tried to get the man to talk, they were unsuccessful. The police were forced to continue gathering information. Joanna's house was thoroughly searched, and more blood was found in the living room, as well as in several places in the courtyard and on the driveway. The traces looked as if she had been taken somewhere. All of these samples were collected for analysis. It was later confirmed that the blood was Joanna's. Authorities suspected Robert had killed his ex-wife, but it remained a mystery why he had decided to commit this act 3 years after their separation. He had already begun to build a new life with another woman. However, the man himself provided a possible motive. It was clear that Joanna's wealth bothered him greatly. He had signed a prenuptial agreement, which theoretically meant that his wife's financial well-being was none of his business. After the divorce, he was entitled to nothing. As it turned out, Joanna wasn't particularly open about her family's finances. Even after the couple separated and Robert moved out, he often returned to her apartment when she wasn't there. He even persuaded his children to give him the new security code for the alarm system, which gave him unfettered access. As it turned out, his main interest was in his ex-wife's documents related to the Simpsons and their own finances. He was obsessed with the idea that Joanna had vast sums of money in various accounts. At times, his fantasies drove him to the absurd. Robert was convinced she owned up to $25 million, to which he would have been entitled without the prenuptial agreement. For a long time, prenuptial agreements were ignored in the British legal system, and court cases ensued. But since October 20, 2010, prenuptial agreements have been recognized without any additional bureaucratic hurdles. Thus, in the event of a divorce, Robert had no claim to a single cent of his wife's assets, and he knew it. Interestingly, the next court hearing in the divorce proceedings was scheduled for November 8 of that year. And now, it was highly likely that this would be their last meeting, after which the marriage would be definitively dissolved. This could be a sufficient explanation for why Robert had decided to kill his wife a week before these events. Alex and Katie were spending the entire vacation with their father. On Sunday, October 31, he was supposed to return them to their mother. Joanna was preparing for the return of her son and daughter, as she hadn't seen them in a long time and missed them, so she baked a chocolate cake and cooked her favorite meal. The woman asked one of her friends to join her for this impromptu feast. Joanna usually invited someone at such times, as she was afraid of her ex, but this time her friend couldn't make it, so she had to welcome Alex and Katie alone. The police spoke with the children. They provided valuable information that clarified all questions. The argument between the parents began immediately when Robert took Alex and Katie to their mother around 4 p.m. They were in another room and couldn't confirm exactly what was going on, but they heard noises that sounded like physical violence. According to the children, it sounded like dull thuds. After a while, the suspicious noises stopped, and Robert carried Joanna out of the room and placed her in the trunk of his car. The father told his children that their mother had fallen and was injured, and that he needed to take her to the hospital. After closing the trunk, the man ordered the children to get into the car and drove them to his home, where they stayed with his new girlfriend. After leaving them there, Robert left immediately and didn't return until around 7 p.m. When he returned home, Joanna was gone. He answered all the children's questions evasively. Robert had about 3 hours, but what he had been doing and where Joanna was remained a mystery. Robert was then questioned again, but he always gave the same answers. He was interrogated 9 times in total, but during each questioning, the man made no mention of October 31 and the events surrounding his ex-wife. After the last questioning, He asked to speak privately with his lawyer. They both went into a separate room. After about 20 minutes, the defense attorney returned and read a statement in which Robert confessed to murdering his ex-wife. The man stated that he and Joanna had argued about something related to their children's education, and at some point he lost control. He only remembered hitting his wife several times. He then wanted to take his children home and drive his wife to the hospital, but after taking the children away, the man discovered that Joanna was already dead. The man panicked and decided to dispose of the body, which he hid in the woods. The man's story sounded unbelievable. After all, Robert could have taken his wife to the hospital immediately. It also remained unclear why he had hidden her in the trunk. Why hadn't he put Joanna in the interior? It seemed as if Robert had known from the beginning that the woman was dead, and therefore, not wanting to frighten the children with the sight of their mother, hide her in the trunk. The man then agreed to lead investigators to the location where she was. The body of the 46-year-old mother of two was indeed found at the specified location. It was obvious that without Robert's confession, it would have been virtually impossible to find the body. He had prepared very well. He had taken Joanna more than 2 kilometers from the nearest road into dense bushes. There, Robert had dug a fairly deep hole, which he then carefully leveled and covered with leaves, as if nothing had happened. It was a truly deep pit, which is why the police didn't believe Robert. There was no sign of freshly excavated earth. It was estimated that he had removed about 400 kilograms of earth in advance, which must have taken a considerable amount of time. The ground was already frozen, making digging even more difficult. It seemed unlikely that all this could have been accomplished in 3 hours. Since there were no signs of digging, it was assumed that he had disposed of the earth elsewhere. The circumstances suggested that he had dug the deep hole in advance. The theory of careful preparation for the murder was later confirmed. The children went to this spot to lay flowers in memory of their mother. They stated that they knew the area well. They even had a secret hiding place nearby. The last time they were here was during the holidays, when they visited their father. He had probably started digging the hole for his ex-wife at that very moment, while the children were playing in their hiding place. Of course, Robert continued to deny that Joanna's murder was carefully planned. He claimed the attack was an accident. He simply lost control due to the stress that had built up during the long and difficult divorce. His lawyer insisted the crime was committed in the heat of the moment, so Robert was entitled to a lenient sentence. The forensic examination revealed that Joanna had received at least 14 blows to the head with a blunt instrument. This involved a hammer with a nail puller, which was found in the same container where the body was hidden. If Robert hadn't planned the crime, why did he bring it to the house? Robert later explained that he had taken the hammer from his shed and hidden it in his daughter's bag, but he couldn't explain why he had done so. In addition, the container contained many other items that supported the theory of a planned crime. A protective suit, plastic overshoes, and rubber gloves were found inside. After the murder, he took the surveillance camera from the house and the hammer and disposed of both. It was obvious that he had carefully prepared and acted rationally before the crime. The murder trial began in May 2011. The prosecution insisted that Joanna was the victim of a carefully planned crime. The defense argued that their client had suffered for years living with a wealthy, arrogant woman who completely controlled him. Robert complained that he had been forced to sign a prenuptial agreement. He explained that this was an attempt to take the money he believed the Simpsons owed him for the years of humiliation he had suffered during their marriage. In a moment, he lost his temper and killed his wife in a fit of rage. When the jury returned with their verdict, they shocked everyone. They found Robert guilty of manslaughter. Instead of receiving a life sentence, the murderer got off with 26 years. 2 of those years were for obstructing the investigation. Under British law, the man would have had to spend 13 years behind bars, with the remainder under police supervision. Robert could have been released in November 2023, but the outraged parents of the murdered woman could not allow that to happen. They spent years campaigning for reform of existing laws on murder and domestic violence. The commission ruled that Robert Brown posed a danger to society, which automatically deprived him of the possibility of release after serving half his sentence. The perpetrator appealed, but his appeal was rejected. He is still behind bars. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.
On the morning of September 1, 2019, the atmosphere in the Sumney family home was tense. The previous day, John Shee, an elderly man and brother of Margaret Sumney, had died in Pennsylvania. Relatives began calling each other to inform them of the tragedy and to arrange the funeral. However, one of the deceased sisters encountered difficulties. She was unable to reach Margaret. This caused concern. After several unsuccessful calls, she decided to contact Helen, Margaret's eldest daughter from her first marriage. Helen immediately tried to call her mother, but her attempts were unsuccessful. Several hours passed, but Margaret never responded by phone or text message. This behavior was uncharacteristic. The mother always stayed in touch and never disappeared without explanation, even for a short time. Suddenly, a call came from her number, but on the other end of the line was not Margaret, but her son, David Lee Sumney Jr., whom the family called Junior. When Helen heard his voice, she was surprised. Junior had not lived with his mother for a long time, and his presence in her house seemed strange to her. She immediately asked where Margaret was. The answer was curt, "She's asleep." That sounded unsettling. It was already well past 9:00 a.m., and on a day when he received news of the death of a loved one, she certainly wouldn't sleep that late. Helen asked her brother to wake her mother, but he declined, suggesting he call back later. He didn't answer any further questions and ended the call. After the call, Helen was troubled. Her brother's behavior seemed cold and strange to her, his appearance at her mother's house inexplicable. She knew that Margaret and Junior's relationship wasn't easy, and his evasions only increased her concern. Margaret Sumney, née Shade, was born on June 28, 1958 in Pennsylvania. Her parents, John and Wheeling Shade, were highly respected in the area and owned a dance school that was very popular with the locals. They had 5 children, Margaret being the youngest. From early childhood, she spent much of her time at the dance school, first as a student, then as an assistant, and later as a teacher. She taught ballet classes, helped organize the annual concerts, and supported the administration. Over time, her contribution to the family business became an indispensable part of its functioning. According to the recollections of acquaintances, Margaret was a cheerful, sociable, and energetic woman. She easily connected with people of different ages, took care of herself, and led an active lifestyle. Her appearance and manners always attracted attention. In everyday life, she was organized and able to get things done. Margaret married very young. Her husband was named John Joseph Thierry, Chirper. However, family life didn't work out. He was emotionally distant and showed no interest in the marriage or the children. They soon separated. This marriage produced 2 daughters, Helen and Peggy. After the divorce, the entire responsibility for the children fell on her shoulders. Her ex-husband took almost no responsibility for them, and she had to combine her maternal duties with work in the studio. Despite the difficulties, she managed thanks to the support of her family and her employment in the family business. Margaret provided a stable home for her daughters. Domestic discipline was combined with care rather than strictness. Over time, David Lee Sumney entered her life, a dentist with a successful career and a Harvard education. He seemed confident, reserved, and charismatic, Margaret and David began dating and married a few years later, in 1986. It was a new phase in their lives, this time more stable and harmonious. The couple moved into a spacious and well-equipped house. There were no financial difficulties, and Margaret and her daughters could afford a level of comfort she had previously only dreamed of. In 1989, their son, David Lee Sumney Jr., was born. The event was of great importance to both his parents and his stepsisters. David Sr. was actively involved not only in the upbringing of his son, but also in that of his daughters, with whom he developed a warm relationship. The family seemed happy, financial prosperity, mutual support, a caring father, and a strong relationship. All this gave the impression of a perfect family. However, behind the facade lay something that no one talked about at the time. The youngest son grew up in complete freedom and unlimited comfort. His parents tried to fulfill his every wish, which quickly led to a consumerist attitude to life. All his wishes were fulfilled without discussion. Gradually, he realized that he could use this to his advantage. Already in elementary school, Junior began to manipulate adults. He demanded a reward for every action. Even simple requests from his parents became an opportunity for negotiations. Refusing help and acquiescing to whims became the norm for him. He took praise for granted but expected material rewards. Thus, a dangerous parenting disorder began to develop in the family, the consequences of which would only become apparent much later. Over the years, Junior's behavior became increasingly problematic. His parents never restricted him in anything. Any dissatisfaction on his part immediately led to concessions. Even when he made excessive, unfounded demands, Margaret and David Sr. did not try to stop him. They believed that by granting their son the freedom, they could maintain a warm relationship with him and build his self-confidence. In practice, however, this only reinforced his sense of omnipotence and superiority over others. One of the most disturbing incidents occurred during his childhood and remained in the family's memory for a long time. Junior found a small bird in the backyard. He picked it up and squeezed it so hard that it died. He showed no fear or guilt. He held the dead bird calmly in his hand, as if it were nothing special. Margaret was shocked. Later, when she talked about it, she said half-jokingly that her son's behavior resembled that of a murderer, but there was genuine concern behind it. This wasn't an isolated incident, and from an early age he showed no empathy, didn't seek emotional contact, and didn't feel responsible for his actions. His parents didn't know how to respond. Instead of trying to change their approach, they continued to hope the problem would resolve itself. However, the lack of clear boundaries only reinforced his destructive personality traits. In 2001, Margaret and David Lee Sumney's marriage broke down. The previously stable relationship began to unravel. The divorce was relatively peaceful, but the consequences were significant. At the time, her son was about 12 years old. After the divorce, Margaret's financial situation deteriorated dramatically. Her ex-husband's support ended, and the income from the family dance studio, which she had previously relied on, was no longer sufficient. The studio began to make losses, and Margaret soon decided to close it. This meant not only the loss of her job, but also of an important part of her life. To cover her ongoing expenses, she had to take a job as a saleswoman in a clothing store. The work was not prestigious, but it was sufficient to cover her basic needs. Her son's demands did not diminish. Junior continued to demand special treatment and the comforts he was used to. His behavior did not change. He expected all his wishes to be met unconditionally. Despite the divorce and his own financial difficulties, David Sr. continued to make concessions to his son. He supported his wife financially, even if this was to his own detriment. Instead of setting clear boundaries, he behaved as before and tried at all costs to maintain contact with his son. Although the former spouses were no longer together, while they lived together, they remained dependent on Junior's behavior. He lived alternately with his mother and father, and both parents continued to fulfill his demands. The teenager practically controlled the adult's behavior, and their desire to please him did not disappear despite the deterioration of living conditions. This phase became critical. Financial difficulties, the loss of stability, and the disintegration of the family coincided with their son's increasingly destructive behavior. The parents did not reconsider their tactics and continued to act according to the old pattern in which Junior's needs took priority. In 2008, at the age of 18, David Lee Sumney Jr. enrolled at university to study mathematics. His parents saw this as an opportunity for change. They hoped that studying at a prestigious institution would help him develop independence and discipline. David Sr. covered his tuition fees. On-campus accommodation was expensive, but the costs were shared between both parents. Margaret and David met their obligations despite their financial constraints. Junior lived in his own apartment near campus. Everything he needed was provided. In 2010, Margaret decided to visit her son. She went to Washington to make sure everything was okay. During this trip, something happened that later raised many questions. She unexpectedly called her daughter Helen and told her that she was in the hospital with Junior. According to her, her son had tried to injure himself with a knife, and she herself had fallen and hit her head. The information was vague. Helen noticed inconsistencies. Her mother didn't explain exactly what had happened, answered evasively, and avoided details. P.S. Upon arriving at the hospital, she learned that Margaret and Junior were in different rooms, even though this wasn't necessary in their case. This struck her as odd. The medical staff also didn't provide a clear explanation. She suspected that the incident had unfolded differently than Margaret had tried to describe. Junior had always behaved erratically, and Helen suspected that a violent argument might have broken out between him and his mother. This suspicion was also supported by the fact that the mother appeared distraught but continued to justify her son's behavior. There was no official investigation following this incident. Neither Margaret nor Junior discussed the causes of the incident. However, shortly after his hospitalization, it was revealed that Junior had been expelled from the university. The school administration had identified systematic violations of regulations and inappropriate behavior. He had missed classes, gotten into conflicts, and ignored teachers' requests. The expulsion was a blow to his parents. After so much effort and investment, they had expected a different outcome, but instead of progress, they received confirmation that their son's behavior was only worsening. Junior was forced to return to Pennsylvania, where he again lived alternately with each of his parents. His studies, which was supposed to mark the beginning of an independent adult life, ended in failure and new troubling signs. In July 2015, a conflict arose between David Lee Sumney Jr. and his father, which became one of the most difficult events in their family history. Junior was 26 years old, neither studying nor working, continued to live off his parents' expenses, and continued to view them as a source of income, regardless of their means. That day, he demanded money from his father for a trip. It was a considerable amount. David Sr., who was struggling with personal financial problems at the time, simply could not fulfill his son's request. He explained that a vacation was impossible because there was no money for it. And there was. Junior accepted but there was no refusal. Instead of ending the conversation, he began to shout and become threatening. The argument escalated into physical violence. Junior attacked his father with brutal force. He hit him with his hands and didn't stop, even when the man could no longer defend himself. Neighbors who heard the screams and sounds of the altercation called the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Junior in the act of beating his father. David Sr. suffered severe injuries. Doctors diagnosed a cerebral hemorrhage, a spinal injury, and multiple bruises. He was taken to the hospital in critical condition. After an examination, the doctors concluded that the patient's condition required constant care. From that moment on, David could no longer move independently. He required round-the-clock care and was later transferred to a nursing home. He could no longer work. Junior was charged, but the classification of the crime confused his relatives. Instead of attempted murder, the investigation was limited to aggravated assault. Despite the severity of the consequences, the court set bail, and Junior was soon released. The victim himself was unable to attend the trial. As before, Junior escaped serious punishment. This case was a turning point for the entire family. The illusion that his behavior was controllable was finally shattered. After the attack on his father and a brief prison sentence, David Lee Summy Jr. was not seriously held accountable. Despite the seriousness of the incident, he remained at large and acted as if nothing had happened. After some time, he told his relatives that he had supposedly joined the U.S. Navy. He actively spread this information among family members and acquaintances, claiming that he had passed the selection and now held a position associated with maintaining discipline and internal order. Margaret once again believed her son. Despite the previous instances of aggression, she saw his statements as an opportunity for change. Military service associated her with a strict but structured environment where one had to follow rules and respect a clear hierarchy. She hoped this would influence his behavior. However, there was no official confirmation of his service. All information came exclusively from Junior himself. He presented no identification, showed no uniform, and revealed no details. He answered all questions evasively or aggressively. At the same time, he began to train intensively. Within a short period of time, his appearance changed dramatically. He built up significant muscle mass and became physically imposing. At almost 2 meters tall, he appeared intimidating, especially to those who had already witnessed his outbursts of anger. These external changes were accompanied by increasing aggressiveness. Junior became irritable, often threatened, and easily lost his temper. Interactions with him became tense. He emphasized his superiority and made no secret of his preference for resolving conflicts with violence. He demanded absolute submission from those around him. His relatives began to doubt the veracity of his stories about military service. Some openly stated that his behavior did not reflect that of a soldier. Junior then began to intimidate her. He clearly left no room for doubt about his story and tried to stop any conversations that might challenge it. In November 2016, another incident occurred at Margaret's house. At night, heavily intoxicated, Junior entered his mother's bedroom and began choking her. The attack was sudden. He used force. Due to his physical superiority, he easily broke his mother's resistance. Margaret woke up because she couldn't breathe. He wordlessly squeezed her throat. The only way to end the attack was to scream and break free. At some point, he let her go and went to his room. Margaret then called the police. Arriving officers found Junior asleep in another room. He was heavily intoxicated. Margaret had marks on her neck and bruises around her ribs. She reported that her son had tried to strangle her, saying, "That's what we do in the Marines." This raised further questions, but initially, attention focused on the actual use of force. Junior was arrested on the spot. The district attorney's office filed a case of aggravated domestic violence. During the investigation, however, Margaret asked that her son's actions not be classified as a serious crime. She insisted that such an entry in the file could ruin his career because he was supposedly a soldier. She claimed that the act was committed under the influence of alcohol and that her son didn't know what he was doing. In her opinion, he needed treatment, not punishment. These statements influenced the investigation. Ultimately, the classification was changed. Instead of criminal charges, he was charged with a misdemeanor offense under the Domestic Violence Act. Thus, Junior avoided severe punishment and was soon released. During the investigation, a background check revealed that he had never registered with the U.S. Navy. The information about his military service was completely fabricated. Junior had not undergone any selection procedures, was unregistered, and had no connection to the military. He had previously assured his mother of this, as well as other relatives, to create the impression that he had a stable and respected profession. The image of a soldier helped him control publicity, inspire confidence, and justify his aggressive personality traits. In fact, it was a form of manipulation. In reality, he was a person prone to violent outbursts, alcohol abuse, and systematic harm to those around him. Even after it was revealed that her son had lied about his military service, Margaret did not change her opinion of him. She continued to hope that he could change. Her decision to stand up for Junior after the attempted strangulation caused confusion among her relatives. However, her actions were not guided by reason, but by a deep emotional attachment that prevented her from objectively viewing the events. Later, in another trial that considered his actions as a whole, including his lying about his military service, Junior was finally charged. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to 16 months in prison. Despite the reclassification of the offense to a less serious one, the sentence included a stay in a detention center. This was the first time he had been held accountable. During his time in prison, Junior actively cooperated with social services. In discussions with representatives of the administration, he emphasized his alcohol addiction and insisted that it was the cause of his behavior. He claimed that he could not control his actions while drunk and that he needed treatment, not imprisonment. This stance was well thought out. He knew that his addiction could be considered a mitigating factor. These arguments impressed the social worker handling his case. A report was prepared recommending that he be transferred to a specialized addiction treatment facility. The court granted this request, and Junior was transferred to a rehabilitation center in Pennsylvania. The program included group sessions, therapy, and daily check-ins. Officially, he was considered a participant in the rehabilitation process. Margaret immediately became involved in the process. She visited her son, brought him necessary items, and spoke with the center's counselors. Despite the previous acts of violence, she once again believed in the possibility of positive change. For her, the mere participation of her son meant the rehabilitation program showed that he admitted his mistakes and was willing to change. After completing the course, Junior was released on parole. He was placed in temporary supervised housing with the right to work. After some time, he found a job. According to the center, he adhered to his daily routine and showed interest in a new life. This created the appearance of positive changes. His relatives began to hope that his aggressive behavior was a thing of the past. Outwardly, he behaved with restraint and gave no cause for complaint. In reality, however, his fundamental attitudes remained unchanged. He did not acknowledge his guilt, did not take responsibility for his past, and showed no remorse. Everything that was done was aimed at reducing the system's control and restoring formal freedom. In August 2018, David Lee Sumney Sr. passed away. He was 74 years old and died in a nursing home where he had been recovering from the injuries he sustained in the attack by his son. Official documents stated the cause of death as a general deterioration in his health. However, his relatives were convinced that the beating in 2015 was the trigger for his rapid physical and mental decline. At the time of his father's death, Junior was at large and was not held accountable for the consequences of the attack. A legal connection between his actions and his father's death was not established. Neither the investigating authorities nor the public prosecutor's office reviewed the circumstances of 2015 in light of the new information. At the funeral, Margaret remained calm and reserved. She made no accusations against her son. Even in the face of the obvious connection between the attack and the death of her ex-husband, she did not change her stance. Her behavior increased tensions within the family. In 2019, Junior began a new relationship. He met a woman through a mobile app. Her name is not mentioned in the files because she wishes to remain anonymous. The relationship developed rapidly. Shortly after they met, she moved in with him. Initially, he behaved correctly, was polite, attentive, caring, and outwardly reserved. This gave the impression that he had changed. Shortly after they began living together, Junior's behavior began to change. He began dictating strict conditions, controlling his partner's daily activities, and demanding absolute submission. Any attempt to contradict him triggered outbursts of anger and aggression. The woman soon noticed the strange behavior. She found checks made out to his mother's name on Junior's property and realized he was using them for personal purchases. When she asked him why he was doing this, he replied that Margaret supposedly suffered from a mental illness and was unable to manage her own finances, and he was only helping her pay the bills. According to him, he regularly signed checks in her name. However, he had no legal basis for such actions, and he had wonders said. There were no documents confirming his mother's incapacity, nor was there a power of attorney. When his partner suggested settling the matter officially, he began to avoid the subject, citing the supposedly lengthy formalities with state authorities. She began to suspect him of dishonesty, but at the time had no evidence to contact the police. When she finally decided to end the relationship, Junior could not accept this. He continued to insist on resuming the relationship, forcing himself on her and showing up unannounced. After another refusal, he resorted to violence. Under the pretext of a meeting, he lured his former partner to a hotel room in Atlantic City and held her there against her will for several days. The woman was physically abused, psychologically coerced, and deprived of her freedom. Junior beat her, restricted her movement, and strangled her several times until she lost consciousness. At one point, he believed she was dead and left the room. The woman was left unconscious and seriously injured, with no way to get help. On the third day, hotel staff noticed the "Do Not Disturb" sign, which hadn't been removed the entire time. One of the employees decided to check the room and found the woman in critical condition. She was immediately taken to the hospital. Doctors diagnosed serious injuries, but thanks to timely assistance, the woman was saved. Police were able to quickly identify the attacker. An arrest warrant was issued, but due to a technical error, the data wasn't entered into the federal database in time. This allowed Junior to leave the state and return to Pennsylvania unhindered. By the time the injured woman was admitted, he was already in another region. Although the warrant was officially issued on July 16, 2019, its absence from the general search system meant that during Junior's next arrest in Pennsylvania in a different case, officers failed to establish a connection to the Atlantic City attack. He was released because he was not listed in the search database. And changed data. This error was the result of a lack of coordination between agencies. As a result, a man who had committed a serious crime remained at large. The consequences of this error were fatal. An even more gruesome crime soon followed. On September 1, 2019, Margaret's brother, John Shee, died. Relatives began calling each other to arrange the funeral, but, as is known, no one could reach Margaret. The next morning, September 2, Helen continued to call. At one point, Junior answered the call. He said he was at his mother's house and her mother was asleep. He avoided further explanation. When asked to answer the phone, he didn't respond and only promised to call back later. His behavior seemed strange to him. To him, the family decided to contact the police and request a check on Margaret's health. A patrol arrived on the scene, but no one answered the door. The house appeared occupied, but there were no signs of movement inside. After several attempts to make contact, the officers decided to force their way in. Upon searching the house, it became immediately clear that something serious had happened. There was a strong odor inside. Traces of blood were visible on the walls and floor. The surroundings indicated a struggle. On the floor, there were traces of what appeared to be a body being dragged. Towels were found that had been used to remove the blood. Margaret's body was found in the second-floor bathroom. She showed no signs of life. Death had occurred at least one day earlier. The body showed numerous injuries, including head and neck trauma. The blood loss and the general condition of the apartment suggested a violent crime. During the examination of the apartment, a metal sickle with brownish deposits was found outside the bathroom. Its location suggested it had been used before the body was placed in the bathtub. It was also discovered that a revolver registered to Margaret had disappeared from the house. Only an empty cartridge box was found in the drawer. The crime scene was classified as particularly serious. Forensic investigators secured all evidence and began examining the devices in the house. Of interest were a laptop and an external USB drive belonging to Junior. An examination of the USB drive revealed 277 photos taken after Margaret's death, Mason of Gowers. The images show the body being transported through various parts of the house. Some images were staged. Junior himself was seen in them, in some cases taking selfies with the body. The visual evidence suggested that the crimes were committed in cold blood and over an extended period of time. Search queries made before and after the crime were also found on the laptop. These included instructions for removing bloodstains, treating surfaces, and examining the stages of decomposition of a corpse. This definitively confirmed that the crime was planned. The crime scene was classified as one of the worst in the investigative team's entire career. bloodstains, chaos in the premises, attempts to conceal evidence, and the amount of digital material pointed to an extremely brutal crime. Initial findings indicated that the perpetrator acted cold-bloodedly, calculatingly, and without any compassion. The police asked Helen for help, who was still in contact with him despite their separation. She agreed to cooperate in the arrest, assuming that Junior would most likely attend Uncle John's funeral. The police organized the arrest on the scene. Junior did indeed show up during the funeral service. He was arrested immediately after the funeral. During a body search, items belonging to Margaret were found: jewelry and checks made out to her name. He was charged with premeditated murder, embezzlement, desecration of a corpse, and a number of related offenses. A psychiatric examination confirmed his sanity. In August 2022, he entered into a plea deal with prosecutors and pleaded guilty to third-degree murder. The court sentenced him to between 20 and 40 years in prison. Taking into account the time already served, he will be eligible for release in 2039, at the age of 50. Margaret's family was dissatisfied with the verdict. They believed the prosecution had compromised by failing to adequately consider the seriousness of the crime. Margaret's sisters and daughters stated that the sentence imposed was disproportionate to the extent of the crime. Junior apologized in the courtroom, stating that he did not understand how he could have committed murder. These words were met with suspicion by the family. For them, everything that had happened was the result of years of violence, impunity, and the system's refusal to intervene in a timely manner. Within a short period of time, the family lost two people: John, the brother, and Margaret herself. After the trial, Helen completely cut off contact with her brother. She no longer considered him part of the family. All that remained were the consequences and the realization that the tragedy could have been avoided. Thanks for watching, and take care.